Welcome to Transportation Chain, a series focused on how current events are impacting transportation, trucking, and supply chain management. My name is Marina Mayer, Editor-in-Chief of Food Logistics and Supply and Demand Chain Executive, and I'm accompanied by my Transportation Chain colleagues, Sarah Jensen, Editor of OEM Off-Highway, Becky Schultz, Editor of Equipment Today, and Kurt Bennick, Senior Field Editor of Equipment Today. Today, we'll be conducting a roundtable discussion on the different changes the trucking and transportation industries have experienced as a result of COVID-19. We'll also detail the market conditions and discuss the challenges, opportunities, and advancements in trucking and transportation moving forward. So let's kind of dive in. I know one of the first things we wanted to talk about was changes brought on by COVID-19. And, we specialize on my end in supply chain and logistics that covers, trucking and transportation. And one of the things that we have seen is this great influx of technology and solutions that were kind of brought to market faster than I think that they were planned on, doing, as well as better focus on last mile distribution, e-commerce fulfillment, trying to load up trucks as much as possible, trying to go to different paths, and just, an overall new way of doing business. Every aspect of a company's supply chain and their trucking department has completely upended and completely changed. And they've had to pivot in order to adapt to this new normal, which, may not go away anytime soon. A lot of them have implemented direct-to-consumer, implemented more contactless, driverless, paperless types of technologies. So from my vantage point, that's kind of the main changes that we've kind of seen in supply chain. I'm sure that that's been experienced in some of your industries as well.
I would say that's definitely true for the construction industry, Marina. We have seen a lot of changes in the workplace from our standpoint in terms of new safety technologies. We've certainly seen some new technologies emerge out of this. We've seen things like contact tracing systems that are being used on job sites to enable tracking of where employees have been and who they've interacted with in the event that they do test positive. We've seen e-ticketing becoming more practice in the industry. Certainly seen some interesting things come out in the way of things like temperature checking devices that are used on the job site. We've also seen things such as QR code-based apps for health screening, different technologies that are emerging, but also the advancement of technologies in the industry. Certainly the construction sector in general has had to pivot a lot. Perhaps where we've seen the biggest changes are in the construction equipment sector, the manufacturing side of things, and in vehicles themselves and how that impacts the drivers. Maybe I'll throw this over to Sarah with OEM Off-Highway to discuss that a little bit.
There's definitely the push for more automation and simplifying how machines are operated has definitely been a push for several years. And with a lot of the changes that have been going on recently, it seems like it's going to be an even bigger push, and same even in the manufacturing side of things for the equipment. There's a lot of talk of stronger push towards use of robotics and automated technologies to help augment tasks and help with the training of unskilled workers and maybe helping bring in more workers who might be more interested in working with these more advanced technologies and making it a little bit more of an exciting industries to work in than has typically been thought of in the past.
Sarah, you've also seen a lot of manufacturers having to pivot, especially early on in the pandemic, pivoting to other products. Do you want to throw something out there about that a little bit? Because it's been interesting to see how they've adapted to keep their workforce moving.
Yeah, there's been a lot, and I'm sure you guys have seen it some on your side. A lot of the manufacturers were working to help manufacture safety supplies like PPE, and there were a few companies that worked together to make some disinfectant robots that could be used in hospitals or in manufacturing facilities or work sites to help safety of workers. And a lot of them are still continuing to produce PPE products because there's still shortages. And with more people returning to work now, there's a bigger demand for it. There's also been some companies who have started making products to help with things like maybe a city bus. There's a special divider a certain company has made to help protect the driver and the people who are utilizing the transit system, and other similar types of products like special door handles and things for trucks and trailers to help with the safety and protection of people. So it's interesting how people have been diversifying a little bit more to help with things and just, okay, there's maybe a little bit less demand for other typical components or equipment. So then this has been a way to overcome that a little bit.
Kurt, you specialize in the trucking side of things, the truck sector. Have you seen anything in particular from either the vehicle standpoint or specific to the drivers?
Yeah, on the trucking side, I think we're seeing some technologies that already existed, but they were being slowly adopted. All of a sudden, the COVID crisis has led to almost immediate adoption. In the long term, it's going to lead to increased efficiencies, and it's actually going to help the organizations as they evolve from the COVID crisis. For example, you had mentioned e-ticketing. We're seeing a lot more because the traditional way of delivering concrete or projects to the job site, you get paper tickets, you have to interact with people, you take them back, the paper tickets get lost. Sometimes, loads don't get billed. Now we're moving to e-ticketing, which is a lot more efficient. You eliminate all the touch points, the paperwork, you make it more efficient for the drivers, and you actually make it more efficient for the accounting departments on the backside because they're not searching for paper tickets or going through trying to figure out what loads were delivered, what can we bill for. It's all automatic and it happens more efficiently. And then on the service side, which is really interesting, is the last couple of years, the manufacturers have really been working towards telematic systems to help diagnose problems with the trucks before they come into the service shop. They've been using telematic data at the construction sites to help re-engineer how trucks are brought into the service bay, that the truck doesn't sit there for 2 days in a service shop getting repaired, which was industry average. But now they're getting the quick repairs done quickly to get trucks turned around quicker. With the COVID crisis, they've taken that step even further, where now you go in and you have remote check-ins. The driver doesn't have to get out, go in to physically check the truck in. He does it online. It's all touchless. The owners get reports back immediately when the truck's diagnosed so they can make more informed decisions instead of waiting for 2 days to find out that truck's not available.
So on the supply chain side, we're seeing a lot of companies prep for current market conditions, changes that are brought on with people working more remote. And, in transportation, that's kind of like a non-existent situation. In the reality of today, it's becoming, kind of more common. Are you seeing that in any of your industries where they're trying to reevaluate how they can have people who may not necessarily need to be in the office working remote to still manage things?
I know on the manufacturing side a bit, there are companies working on software products and things so that those that maybe don't actually need to be in the office or on the manufacturing site can still monitor things from a remote location. And like office workers, a lot of them are still remote. And I know on the engineering side too, there's been a push for a while now, but especially now with software and design tools that can be accessed easily from anywhere. And there's easier collaboration between people here in the US and your colleagues over in Europe or China. There's been a bigger push recently.
Right. And on the construction side, I think that this has been a real eye-opener for a lot of companies where they are suddenly being introduced to technologies such as Zoom and other types of technology that allows them to communicate in a way that they'd never even thought of. You're seeing dealers using it to interact with customers in both the service side of things and on the sales side. You're seeing contractors using it for example, estimators or office personnel, upper level management. Rather than being physically in the office, they've been forced to adapt and utilize new forms of communication to be able to keep projects moving forward. Certainly there's a large percentage of people that are physically on a job site and they can't use these technologies, but they're trying to find other ways through different apps and things like that that allow them to be able to communicate effectively and quickly without having to physically be interacting with each other on the job site even. It's really been very eye-opening from that standpoint. I think they're also finding that online training tools are definitely a way to get that skill set build up that they need to address the skills gap in a way that they really haven't taken advantage of to this point yet. They're using things, virtual training technology, things like that are enabling them to get the training that is required without having the physical classroom setting that they have traditionally used. So it's been a very eye-opening experience for the construction sector.
We started seeing the introduction of collaboration software, and I think this is really starting to drive more of the move towards collaboration software where project managers can actually manage remotely more than having to actually be on site to actually check on the progress of the jobs.
We've also seen more wearables, because I know Sarah brought up robotics earlier, but they were designed to kind of just protect the facility, from intruders, or just kind of make sure everybody's kind of in the right spot, especially if they produce allergens, it's segregated to a certain spot of the facility. But now they're utilizing these wearables to kind of track and monitor how many people are actually in the facility at the same time and make sure that they're spaced apart. Because in our industry, a lot of the manufacturing has been impacted because they're on the lines. And so they have to be removed, or, you have to watch your head count. And then, like we've seen in meatpacking facilities, somebody gets sick, they have to shut everything down. And then we've also seen the wearables used when they're starting to make other equipment, like we've seen the automotive makers, make the PPE equipment as well. But they still have to realign how they stand on the line and where they are at the dock and where they are at the loading station, and who's manning the trucks. So it's just interesting to see, the types of technologies that are being also used in different ways than they were probably initially created.
One of the things that's interesting is I know that there's at least one supplier in our industry who developed essentially an object detection type of technology so that a worker would wear that to minimize the risk of being hit by a vehicle as it's moving around the site. It alerts the operator in the cab to the fact that there's someone behind them or around them that could be a potential injury risk. But that manufacturer adapted that technology to be able to identify where those workers are on the job site and how they're interacting with other workers. And that's where that contact tracing comes in. There's other technology that it's essentially a location tool that's being adapted as well. And how that technology will play out once the pandemic is over will be interesting. I actually spoke to a company that is using it as a technology now to be able to keep track of where workers are and their space apart to maintain social distancing. But they're looking at that as a technology that could evolve to become useful for safety on the job site down the road. So it will be interesting to see where some of this technology evolves next. Kurt, you were about to say something as well.
Yeah, I was just going to say the wearables, like you talked about, adapting them. Pretty interesting. Collision avoidance is huge on our construction sites because you have machines operating around humans. And the key is to keep humans and machines separated. But now you're keeping people separated from people. These devices actually give you audible warnings if you get within 6 foot of another employee on the job site.
Sarah, what are you seeing in the manufacturing sector? Are you seeing any of that technology being used?
Yeah, there's been some reports of companies utilizing that kind of stuff, having to reconfigure their manufacturing setups so that they can keep people at a safe distance, taking temperature checks and using some of those types of technologies as well, just to help people ensure that they're keeping a distance and keeping safe.
I think that we're going to see further advances in technology and increases in technology adoption. I think that we probably need to move on to another topic at this point because there's a lot that we're trying to cover here in our chat. The next step is maybe looking at market conditions and where we stand right now. Marina, what does your sector of the industry look like?
So the market conditions completely upended overnight, pretty much. We deal with the food logistics, we deal with pharmaceutical logistics, we deal with the automotive side of things, and anything that involves e-commerce. When the pandemic hit, everybody flocked to the grocery stores and stockpiled. And so in our industry, it was a lot of stock outs. It was a lot of trucks trying to pivot and get there in time, a lot of manufacturers scrambling to make enough product. And then everything kind of shut down. People still need food. They still need medicine. They still need supplies. And we saw a lot of these food service distributors kind of pivot because they could no longer supply to restaurants that were closed and schools were closed and daycares were closed. So they pivoted their model and they instead started supplying product to people's homes. And that's just a completely different channel for them. But then, e-commerce in itself just kind of bloomed. All these grocery retailers have had to implement some kind of a direct-to-consumer channel. And, we've seen a lot of the fashion retailers kind of struggle because people aren't buying clothes as much. They're home. We've seen a lot of other things struggle. We interviewed somebody in one of our previous transportation chain episodes on American transportation industry. And she talked about how, things like, just when you go to see a play, you get your pamphlet and you get your food. But when those theaters close down, all of that shuts down. People's costumes, how that's being shipped. You just don't think of things like that. But then we've also seen a lot more robotics and automation being implemented alongside workers, not instead of workers. And I think that's kind of the big caveat that everybody gets confused about is, oh my God, my job's being replaced. And it's those robotics are there to help, especially in sub-zero temperatures, trying to help them. But, it's called the supply chain shock. Everything just kind of turned upside down and everybody just woke up and said, we got to make this work. I'm sure that, especially with some of the construction sites and manufacturing in general, I'm sure you're dealing with some of the similar market conditions. Sarah, I'm sure you're dealing with it as well on your end.
Since we deal on the heavy equipment manufacturing and design side, equipment demand went down. In some markets, it was already starting to go down in general at the end of 2019 and the beginning of 2020. But once the pandemic hit, things kind of stopped, even though manufacturing was still considered an essential industry in the US. And, component suppliers did a little bit better because many of them were supplying to the trucking side as well. But equipment demand is low, and most of the equipment manufacturers have started releasing their second quarter reports, and sales are still down. Demand is not expected to pick up again until maybe late in the year, probably not even until 2021. The demand isn't quite there, and supply chain issues for the manufacturers would shut down if they got supplies from China or other countries that were shut down sooner than maybe in the US, and there was just a lot of disruptions with that for manufacturers. So now as places are reopening, they're all slowly ramping up again and trying to get back to a semblance of normal, but it's difficult and there's still a lot of uncertainty that they're all dealing with some of the spikes in cases in various areas. It's still just a lot of uncertainty and slow, hopeful we'll get back to a sense of normal.
Right. And I think that uncertainty is definitely impacting how contractors are viewing things as well, the construction sector in general. We certainly saw that many places saw construction as an essential business, and a lot of places did see construction continue to move forward. Certainly had its share of supply chain disruptions. Certain materials were in short supply, and actually we're seeing more supply chain shortages and disruptions because of the reopening and jobs starting to come up. But the production of those materials hasn't necessarily matched demand. And so that's become a real challenge for contractors. There's certainly some lessons to be learned from that. I had spoken early on with Joe Piro at Gilbane Building Services, and he shared some of his insights on that and the fact that contractors are being forced to discover new ways to communicate with their suppliers. And there's definitely a need for them to look at other options for suppliers in a way that they never had to deal with before. They're looking at stretching their communications with each other, with their peers, to help develop a collective buying power in a way that is even more critical than it was previously, so that they have the ability to negotiate pricing. It's reinforced the need to develop and leverage relationships among their suppliers to ensure greater visibility and to keep those lines of communications open. And he actually sees opportunities for the future in the real-time sharing of information between stakeholders. On top of that, I'd like to also expand on the whole issue of e-commerce that you mentioned, Marina. One of the interesting things that we are seeing is that the industry is moving more and more to online buying of equipment because of the circumstances. I mentioned the whole interaction with the dealers through Zoom and other platforms. That's another form of online buying that's becoming bigger and bigger in the construction sector. But you're also seeing platforms such as online auction services becoming much more prevalent than they once were. And that's where a lot of contractors are turning to in a time when they can't physically go to see that equipment and kick the tires, so to speak. It's just evolving the way that they're considering options for purchasing equipment. But I think that rental is also another area where we're seeing a big growth in the construction equipment market. And that is something that generally, when you're moving out of recession, rental sees a resurgence in the construction equipment sector. I think that's going to become an even bigger factor in this recovery because of the high level of uncertainty that's still out there due to the surge in COVID cases around the country. I think the used equipment market is also going to be highly prevalent. Kurt, I'd really be curious what you've heard recently about the trucking sector and the truck industry in general.
Well, it was interesting. We just sat through an economic conference where Stephen Ladenkasper, who's the chief economist, a very well-known economist with the trucking industry, laid out his forecast. And he kind of put things in perspective. GDP in the second quarter fell 34%. The last time we saw that was in the 1930s. That kind of puts it in historical perspective. And during the 1930s, it happened over several years. Here, we fell off a cliff in basically a month. So it's going to be a little bit of rebuilding. And the truck side, you have to come from the perspective that we were at an all-time high for truck sales like in 2019. So we were already looking at a down market, just as natural business cycle, a correction in the market, but not to the degree that happened after this. Basically, we've seen a 30% drop in Class 8 sales. But what we're going to see going forward is a lot of these numbers are skewed a little bit because we were going to see a natural downturn and the plant shut down. So that also has an impact on the truck sales numbers because it's not as bad as it looks on paper. Like the high roof van market, there's actually a huge demand for high roof vans, but because they were switching over from low roof vans to high roof vans and the plant shut down, there's a big demand for high roof vans the manufacturers are struggling to keep up with. So there is still a demand out there. There's a demand for straight trucks and trucks for body upfitters. If they could get more trucks, they would produce more bodied up trucks. They just can't get the trucks at this point.
Yeah, I've also noticed, we saw a report from the Council of Supply Chain Manufacturing Professionals. They said that COVID-19 has been more economically damaging than a standard recession or even an escalation of trade tensions. And that kind of piggybacks onto what you said, Kurt. Like there's a lot of facets that have been up, but there's a lot of facets that have been down. And the ones that are down can be detrimental to certain parts of our business that we deal with because they're trying to go uphill, and it's an uphill battle that there is no end in sight for some of them. But on the plus side, in terms of construction, in supply chain, we're seeing a lot more distribution centers being built because they have to add that extension to their mix. We've also seen a lot more micro-fulfillment centers. We've seen a lot more ghost kitchens. So we've seen a lot more shared spaces. And a lot of companies are in talks of doing that because they want to kind of own that territory. But they also kind of want to better regulate it and have that option available because we don't know what's going to happen in, 6 months or even a year. So I think they're doing it to just prepare themselves for, the next go around if there is one. But for the construction side of things, that may be a good opportunity for some of that business to kind of pick up a little bit.
Actually, from Steve's forecast, it was interesting that he noted during the last downturn, the 2008-2009 downturn, construction was one of the last to go into the downturn. It was also one of the last to recover. Construction industry with the infrastructure side is actually leading the recovery coming out of the COVID crisis. And he looks at construction as being a bright spot and infrastructure being a bright spot, leading the markets back out of this crisis.
I think that that's a good point that you bring up, Kurt, because infrastructure has the capability to really drive the economic recovery at this point. And that certainly is something that would benefit both the construction sector that builds the infrastructure, but it would also help on the supply end because it creates a safer infrastructure for moving materials and goods to and from locations. Certainly can drive up demand for construction equipment, which would be good for your market sector, Sarah. I think the thing that's challenging right now is that we are already approaching very rapidly the next presidential election. The Senate package, they're discussing the most current economic relief package for the pandemic. And the Senate proposal didn't even include infrastructure as part of that package. And that's worrisome because there is the potential that we won't see the investment that's needed. The current highway bill, the FAST Act, is expiring at the end of September. It took 36 extensions of the last highway bill to get to the 5-year bill that we currently have in place. It really does not bode as well as I'd hoped, given the fact that there's bipartisan support for infrastructure investment, but it does not seem as realistic that we may see that investment happen in 2020. There's still a possibility, but right now it's looking less and less likely that we're going to see the big package that everyone had hoped for that could help stimulate the economy.
Yeah, Becky, playing on your point, one of the things we did hear from the forecast that was brought up as an important point was, unlike the federal government, none of the states are allowed to deficit spend. And they're seeing a tax shortfall right now. So in order for a decent infrastructure package to pass, we are reliant on the federal government to step in and help or form partnerships with the states.
State tax revenue shortfalls is huge right now. The fact that there just is not the revenue coming in from all different levels to help support transportation spending and other public works programs is a big problem area. And federal investment is going to be key to overcome that. So now that we've delved into this area, should we move on to another topic? I think workforce development is a huge issue for all of the sectors that we cover. Marina, what are you seeing on your side of things?
We're seeing what we've all called the good, bad, and the better. The workforce development, the bad part of that is it's all online. It's very hard to train people to drive a car or a truck online. It just is. A lot of CDL tests kind of were suspended for quite some time when a lot of the DMVs closed down. So you had truck drivers out there, depending on who the company was, just driving a truck that weren't licensed, that, maybe didn't know how to operate it properly. It was a little unsafe. That's kind of concerning, but some companies kind of were a little bit better about that. But in terms of, transportation itself, it has skyrocketed. There have been so many jobs out there. In previous interviews I've done, they've said upwards of 700 new jobs just created from this pandemic because these companies need drivers. They need people to help manage the fleet. They need people to help operate a lot of the stuff. You think of a pandemic and pre-clips to the depression, there's no jobs. There's tons of jobs. They're just different kinds of jobs. And a lot of the challenge in our industry, I know Sarah brought it up earlier, is trying to entice today's youth to kind of say, hey, the supply chain industry is very cool to be a part of. And I've had several discussions with so many of these organizations that are really trying to do that, just really sell our industry. And truck driving isn't just about sitting behind a truck and driving. Today, there's a lot more that's involved in it. There's a lot of fleet management. There's a lot of operations that go behind it. And I think that aspect of it, the technology side of it especially, can be very welcoming to a lot of today's youth. So workforce development is definitely going to constantly be an issue, but the jobs are there. It's just they're being taught differently. And I think that's a challenge depending on who you are.
And I think that's definitely parallels what we're seeing in the construction industry. The construction industry has a branding issue. The industry is perceived as that worker who's out on the job site with a shovel. And there's so much more involved in the industry than that. You have estimators, you have drone pilots, you have people who are utilizing all kinds of technology on the job site now. It really does open doors to trying to attract a new workforce. And we're in a unique position in the industry in that, we have this big pool of workers out there who are available. It's just a matter of trying to get them interested in construction careers and in trucking careers and in manufacturing careers. And that's the big challenge because that is something that a 4-year degree is not necessary to be able to have a good, productive career.
Yeah, so on the manufacturing side with workforce development, attracting and retaining employees has been difficult for a long time, and it's still expected to continue being an issue, even though that once, manufacturing kind of ramps up again. There's a lot of organizations like the Association of Equipment Manufacturers that are trying to get involved and help work with the industry to help figure out ways to make it more attractive and entice people to come, because in manufacturing, they are good paying jobs and not everybody wants to go to college. And when I spoke with Julie Davis recently, the workforce development director at AEM, she talked about some of the challenges that the industry has been facing and how AEM is working with the industry and how they're trying to work with schools to get them to kind of shift the discussion with students. And one of the things she pointed out is if people don't have any sort of experience or see these industries, then they don't necessarily know they exist or what they could all entail. And that's a really important aspect of potentially attracting future workforce. And again, like we also discussed before, the advancements in technology are only anticipated to keep growing, with many younger people, growing up with video games and growing up in a technological age. There's correlations with that. And so they want to include a lot of those aspects as well.
And we're seeing that too on our side of things, Sarah, where a lot of the industry associations are working with contractors on the local level, and even contractors themselves are working with the local schools to try to reinforce the opportunities in the construction and trucking sectors in regards to high-paying, high-growth careers that don't require the expensive 4-year college education that we all have and the debt that you come out of college with. You can have a valuable career and a lot of growth opportunity in construction, manufacturing, the supply chain industry, and even in the trucking sector, without having that expense of a 4-year college degree. And it's just a matter of getting those jobs in front of students early and often in order to help them to understand what those opportunities are. Kurt, I know you've had a conversation recently with someone at a trucking school.
Construction training and trucking at ATS in Sun Prairie, Wisconsin. And it was pretty interesting talking to them because along the same lines of attracting people, the audiences that they attract for the construction training school are dramatically different than the trucking school. They said usually the people they get in for construction training are young 20-somethings that decided early on in high school or early on in their careers, this is something they want to do for a living. On the other side, the trucking side, the average age is 35 to 40 years old for the trucking drivers. I don't want to say it's a fallback position, but it's really somebody that's been in a career, decided, I don't like this, I'm going to go out and drive a truck. And that's where they're getting a lot of the truck driving side. Truck driving side is interesting because they kept trying to reinforce that there's so much opportunity there. As the economy recovers, we're still projecting within a couple of years to have 160,000 employee shortage in the trucking industry. That's not going away. That's why a lot of these companies are going towards technologies. They're trying to minimize the effort it takes, trying to expand the driver pool, and trying to automate things so that maybe you can do platooning where one truck driver can operate several trucks, because there is going to be a dramatic truck driver shortage coming forward. The problem right now is the COVID crisis is even their training school is running into issues. They used to load the trucks up with 3 or 4 guys, take them out all day and train 3 or 4 operators at once. Now they're only allowed to have 1 student in the truck at a time with the driver. So they're dramatically reducing the number of people they can put through their school. And he was in Wisconsin, he said, which is lucky because they contract their CDL inspectors so that they're able to get more through. Some of the states do it through the DMVs. And like you said, a lot of the DMVs are closed. I just talked to a contractor out in front of my house the other day who was celebrating because one of their guys got a CDL on his first attempt. And they were glad they did that because if he didn't get it on his first attempt, they would have to go back in line and wait in order to try to take the test again. And it could be a month down the road before he could even take the test again. So yeah, there's a lot of problems now, hurdles put in place because A, we have a shortage, B, we have a pipeline. Trying to get drivers to the pipeline has been really constricted. So it's created a challenge on both ends. There's a demand, but yet we can't fill the supply at this current time.
And to your point, Kurt, because I've heard the exact same thing on our end from you, the average age is at least 35. A lot of these guys and girls are coming in and maybe they got laid off, or maybe they just don't like the environment they're in. And so they're trying something new, and these jobs are available. When things kind of go back to normal, do you see that age bracket kind of going away, saying, okay, I'm done here, I'm going to go back and find another job? Because I feel like that may be a hurdle they will have to kind of deal with going forward.
I think that's a hurdle they're continuing to deal with, because I think they wish the age was younger. A lot of drivers are aging out, and that's where a lot of this technology is starting to come in. I know we have these assisted driving systems, automatic transmissions. It's not just for novice operators. I've sat through several seminars where the trucking companies are doing everything they can to keep these older drivers in the seat, because truck driving, after several years, it does do a lot of wear and tear on the body. And that's why you're trying to get to automatic transmissions. You're trying to go to driver assist. You're trying to help keep these people in the seat as long as you can, because there's just not a good supply of young drivers to replace the aging out drivers.
And that's one of the challenges just in construction in general, is the fact that we're seeing a number of the top skilled, most experienced construction workforce aging out. Either they're aging out or they're opting out due to the COVID crisis. Yes. They just don't see the risk being worthwhile. We are seeing a huge intellectual property is leaving the industry in a significant way, not being replaced rapidly enough. That is a huge challenge that the industry is going to have going forward.
Yeah, I know upskilling is a big thing in our industry as well, which kind of goes into that, trying to provide opportunities for individuals to kind of move up in the company or just take on more roles so that they can expand their job description, I guess you could say. And there's tons of reports out there that say, the younger generation, they're bored, or they don't feel like they're being challenged enough, or they're scared of what the future has in store for them. That's a challenge in itself for the younger generation, and then compile that with the challenge of the older generation, like you said, Becky, opting out. That's something we have to consider. There's a certain age bracket of people who are just, I can't be a part of this right now for health reasons. So it's a lot of struggles.
I agree. And just helping, especially the younger workers, to recognize that there are opportunities for growth within both our industry segments, I think is a big challenge, because I look at the number of construction contractor business owners who grew up from being someone who was a laborer on a job site to starting their own company and running their own business. There are numerous examples of that in our sector, but that message just isn't being conveyed effectively enough. And I think that is something that the industry is really struggling to try to get people to understand, that there are opportunities out there. Sarah, are you seeing the same thing in the manufacturing sector?
The struggle to attract younger workers. Training is also a big issue. It's something, I know we were talking before about infrastructure investment from the government, but there's also a push that there needs to be more investment in manufacturing and maybe help with training to make it easier on manufacturers to train people on, because as more technology enters these fields, it will take more training. Same with construction, the automation of underground mining equipment and those kinds of things too. It's going to shift the job. People need to be trained differently and for these different jobs. So that will continue to be a challenge. But I think government investment could help. And again, just kind of shifting how people go about it. And is it the company themselves that maybe invests in that training, or do they find somebody that can help them to do that training?
You bring up an interesting point, Sarah, in the fact that things such as automation, remote operation of equipment, which is something else that we're seeing. And I think it's even touching the trucking sector in some ways as well, as far as just the automation of vehicles in certain ways. It's changing the dynamics there, and it's changing the roles people ultimately will play on construction job site or on the highways. And so that's something that we're certainly going to see some requirement for retraining of existing workers and attracting more experienced people on the technology side to help address that. But we're also seeing changes in equipment design and in the vehicles, as Kurt mentioned earlier, to help automate functions in a way that helps make it easier for less experienced operators and drivers to come in and be able to use the equipment. looking ahead, I think that, there's so much that we could talk about in our discussion, but I think one of the things I'd like to touch upon next is just taking a look at what's coming. And it's really a difficult time right now to look into the crystal ball, I think, for all of us, because there is so much still that's uncertain because we have not beaten COVID-19 at all. We've seen a pretty significant resurgence of the pandemic throughout different areas of the U.S., and that complicates things. But I think one of the things from at least our market sector, the construction standpoint, we are seeing some positive reports coming out. We're seeing things such as confidence in the building industry is up. We're seeing contractors are more positive about the potential now that the industry has fully reopened. Even though jobs are not where they used to be, we're not seeing the level of projects. We saw a lot of projects get postponed or canceled altogether because of COVID-19. We're starting to see the most recent construction backlog indicator, which is something that the Associated Builders and Contractors put out. The most recent one was for June, and it actually had a very mild uptick. But that in itself is a positive thing because it means that contractors are starting to see at least a stabilization of the amount of work that they have on the books. And there's still a lot of uncertainty about what will come down the road, a year or two from now. But right now, contractors have work on the books. And that's a really positive thing. And we're seeing some very sizable projects continue to move forward and actually start in the last 2-3 months that are helping to boost construction activity right now. We've seen that another leading indicator for the construction industry is the Architectural Billings Index that the American Institute of Architects puts out. And their most recent forecast is showing that even though billings on the architectural side have declined slightly, it's not declining as fast. And that means they're starting to see more project owners coming to them and saying, we're interested in getting projects designed for future work. And that's a big plus going forward. So I think that there are definitely some really good signs out there. It's still some challenging things going on out in the marketplace, but we're definitely seeing some positive things. And that's going to certainly affect your industry, Sarah.
Definitely, yeah. And we've been hearing that, while things are down now, that's not going to be how it is forever. There's still going to be construction projects going on, infrastructure investment, especially in other countries. So the global construction equipment market is still anticipated to grow at a rate of 4% through 2026 due to investments in mining and infrastructure projects. People still need raw materials for things. There's also a continued push towards mechanization, especially in regions of the world that maybe haven't been using mechanized equipment as much as we do here in the US. So that will help to continue pushing equipment demand. Most recent agricultural equipment data from AEM, sales were up for agricultural equipment, tractors and combines in both the US, and for the first time this year, tractor sales were up in Canada. So that's been showing there's some positive movement in that industry. People still need to eat. Farmers are going to need to eventually replace equipment. Same with on the construction side. There have been some positive signs. A lot of companies say they're still going to keep investing in technology. Technology, as we keep mentioning, is going to continue being important. Cummins Engines, their CEO, Tom Lineberger, mentioned in the company's second quarter report that while there's a lot of uncertainty still with the company, it's going to continue prioritizing investments in technology and new products, like hydrogen fuel cells, electrification, automation. These are still things companies are going to be investing in, which I think is definitely a positive for a lot of our markets.
And I understand the truck side of things is still quite weak, but I think there were some bright spots in the most recent report that you sat in on.
One of the interesting things that crosses all our industries, we all use diesel fuel. One of the bright spots is diesel fuel is almost an all-time low right now, which is helping fleets overcome the extra burden of what's going on in the marketplace, both construction and transportation logistics fleets. One of the bright spots is when this recovery happens, Most people are convinced that diesel prices are going to continue to stay low. And one of the driving factors is they think we've seen a permanent shift in the number of commuters that we're going to see on the roads. One of the things they're predicting is you're not going to see people commuting to jobs like they did in the past. You're going to see a lot more telecommuting going forward, which is going to help on all fronts hold down fuel prices because you're not going to be on the roads as much. Individual trucks, some of the bright spots we're seeing out there are, we have to remember that these low sales numbers, a lot of it was driven by plants being shut down. In certain aspects, there still is a strong demand. One of the most positive signs we're seeing is body upfitters are clamoring for trucks. There's a backlog, people trying to get straight trucks. But the plants have been shut down, and plants are not operating at 100% efficiency right now. Plants are still operating at a very reduced capacity, so they're not keeping up, even at the lower levels. So there will be a recovery. I mean, going forward, they will catch up. And we're looking like they said, by 2022, they expect things to be on a better track. One of the questions I had for Marina was what came up during the economic outlook was American Trucking Association expects freight shipments to actually, the index to dip below zero for a very short time. But then they expect continued recovery throughout the next year. What are you hearing, Marina?
That is exactly what I'm hearing. And a lot of that is because a lot of the companies are at their point where they figured it out. You know, they took a couple of months and they kind of redid their model. And so now they're figuring it out. And now they're figuring out what works and what doesn't. They have the technology on board. Maybe they have the people on board. And I think, you know, the good part about, positive side, I guess, about all this is that, you know, this pandemic or any kind of a natural disaster or a crisis of some kind, it always tests the supply chain. It always tests the resiliency of it, the transparency of it, and the strength of it. And I think that the positive side of this from my vantage point is that the supply chains continue to win. They continue to move the product from point A to point B. And the people that are in all of our industries, they want to be in their industries. They're passionate, they're invested. You know, this is their livelihood. This is what they love to do. And so when something like this hits, they will do everything in their power to come together, whether they're competitors or not, and to make things work. And I think that's the shining light that I've seen from where I sit, because I've watched companies who have been doing business for so many years one way completely change their model just so that they can get food off of the truck so it doesn't go to waste. Even if they're delivering it to somebody's front door, or it's medicine, or PPE, or whatever the case is. I feel that that is a positive thing. And I know that this dip that you referred to, Kurt, I think a lot of them are also bracing for a second round. You know, we keep saying life after the coronavirus. Well, we're not there yet. I think we're kind of still in it. We're just in between, I guess you could say. And so we're all kind of bracing for what's to come, and we don't know when that will be. If it does come, how bad it will be. But I think the other positive is now with all of this infrastructure, with all this technology investment, companies are a little bit more prepared. I think a little bit more ready.
I would agree with everything that you're saying, Marina. I think that it really has been interesting how companies and industries have all come together to kind of take advantage of the lessons that we've learned during the pandemic and to help each other to ensure that we all get through this together.
It's a great thing to see with people, because in such a fractured world as we are today, you know, it's good to see these industries really pull through, get things moving, and get, you know, the common good of the industry as a whole to a better place. Well, with that, I appreciate all of your input from where I sit. This has been really fun doing this all with you. And I think that, you know, all of our industries kind of overlap to some degree. So we're able to kind of put together some great ideas and some talking points. So to all of our viewers, thank you for watching. And be sure to visit our respective websites to view all of our Transportation Chain episodes. So thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Becky. Thank you, Kurt. I appreciate it. This has been fun.
Thank you, Maria.
Yeah, thank you.